Let's cut across now to my colleague Barkha Dutt, who is on Google Hangout on talking on the role of the internet in politics.
Decided to use anything I said on social media to attack me meant that all the other politicians shrunk away. And the very people who'd asked me said, Abdu, we're not going to touch this. You know, this is clearly too dangerous for us to go in. Thereafter, of course, the controversies kept mounting, as did the followers, but people stayed away. I still remember the then president of the BJP, Venkaiah Naidu, saying, as it turned out prophetically, too much tweeting can lead to quitting. Do you remember that? That was sort of that was the attitude by then of the political class, and frankly, who wanted to buck the mainstream media, which is what you want to deal with. But in my case, it actually redoubled my determination, because I realized that I had to get past this negative filter in the mainstream media to talk to people directly, who knew what I was trying to say and could relate to me, even if they weren't in the political space. Fortunately, all that has changed. For the reasons that Stephanie's mentioned, people have become aware they can't afford to give this a miss.
But have we reached that point where Indian politicians can't afford to neglect the online space? Have we reached that point?
Just two things. I mean, in late 2009, I gave an interview saying, and at the time when I was when even well-meaning friends were coming to me saying, you know, you proved your point, now give up Twitter and so on. I gave an interview saying, look, for God's sake, within 10 years, I said every serious Indian politician will be on social media. And I think the 10 years now turns out to be far too late a prediction, because already the majority of major politicians, including ministers of the government and opposition leaders, including the gentleman who's going to follow us on the stage, they are all on Twitter.
Narendra Modi.
And yes. Exactly. So what you've got, in other words, is a widespread consensus that it's necessary. However, you're totally right. With 12% internet penetration, none of us expects a Twitter account or a Facebook page to win us an election, because none of us will have a majority of our voters, not even Bombay South, Million's constituency, whatever, will have a majority of voters on the internet. So why do we use Twitter? Well, first of all, it gives us an extraordinary interactive medium. You know, we can actually answer questions from ordinary strangers, not just from very visible television anchors. We can respond to the concerns of the Aam Aadmi, as it were, on this space. And at the same time, we can get our messages out without you all editing it or misreporting it, which still continues to happen extensively. The third thing, which I believe has turned out to be very important for the gentleman whose name we mentioned, is the brand building aspect. That you use...
The one who cannot be mentioned.
You know, I no doubt will come around to it eventually. But my point was that you actually have the idea of using your presence on the social space to create a sort of brand identity for yourself, which is actually not directly linked to the votes you may or may not win, but which will undoubtedly have an indirect ripple effect, because the people who are on the internet, it is hoped, will talk to and influence and shape the agenda of others. And finally, you guys in the traditional media have stopped this antagonistic relationship to those of us on social media. You are now mining the social media for news stories. Actually, things we say on social media are becoming news. You're quoting us. You yourself, Barkha, are very much on social media in a very prominent way. And so that brief antagonism that I witnessed in my first year on social media, I think has now more or less faded. Therefore, it's no longer a problem with the mainstream media. All of these factors, I think.
So it's not a problem, Omar, but is it useful? And I think what Shashi is alluding to is a wider public narrative, and also an effective means of just getting your message out in one fell swoop. You put it on Twitter and everybody picks it up. I want to ask you that someone like you, according to me, probably has amongst the toughest jobs in the country today. You're the chief minister of really one of the most difficult, complex states. You have seen in the past few weeks a very volatile time, and you have chosen on occasion to use a platform like Twitter to say what you have to, whether it's calling out to what you perceive to be a doublespeak in how grief expresses itself in the valley, whether it's to tell the opposition I'm not resigning, and so on. But you have at other times also spoken about how insanely provocative the negativity can get online. And you said, hang on, I'm not going to be bullied off this space, and that's part of the reason I'm here. What keeps you online?
I think the advantages of social media far outweigh the disadvantages. As long as you can develop a thick enough skin to read your timeline and to digest the barrage of abuse that gets heaped on you, you can survive it. Every once in a while, I need to take a break.
Yeah.
When things get particularly bad in the state, I step back from social media because, quite honestly, I just can't deal with the distraction. But in terms of the opportunity it affords me to get a point of view across in the shortest possible span of time, it is irreplaceable. There is nothing that I say on Twitter, rightly or wrongly, that doesn't get picked up in a matter of seconds. I mean, if there is a rumor going around that needs to be corrected, by the time I get my information department to type out a press note, verify the contents of it, then put it out, the story is already too old.
Yeah.
140 characters on Twitter, and I can be rest assured that TV channels will have it on their ticker within seconds. So my job is done.
So the loser in this whole story is really the traditional media, right?
Look, I don't...
You jumped on the bandwagon now.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys are following everyone on Twitter who's worth following to see what they say.
Yeah.
And whatever we do say gets picked up and used as
But can I
news.
ask you that the immediacy is obviously a great plus, but is it a downside sometimes for politicians, if both of you will speak to this? Because sometimes, and this has happened to me, you say something and then you bite your tongue because you've got into a scrap online.
That's happened to me as well.
Yeah.
But I have an advantage that Shashi doesn't.
Which is?
I belong to a regional party. I'm pretty high up the pecking order, and therefore I'm unlikely to get into trouble for saying things. Unlike Shashi, unfortunately. While his party talks about using social media, when he does say something, it's the same party that turns and says, no, these views should be expressed internally. They should not be shared with everybody else. He needs to learn when to keep quiet. So he has a slightly bigger problem than I do.
Before I get Stephanie in on that, anything you said on Twitter and then you bit your tongue?
But actually, I was thinking of a famous example involving Omar, which is about a year and a half ago, I think. Omar said something on Twitter. I still don't know what it was. And a bunch of well-meaning friends immediately said, Omar, take that off. It's going to be misquoted. You're going to get in trouble. Omar promptly deleted that tweet, so that to this day the advice to delete can be found on Twitter, but not the offending tweet itself. So clearly he's done something quickly enough. Whereas in my case, usually I tweet on the car between appointments and things like that. So if I make a boo-boo, however many people advise me to correct it, by the time I read their advice, it's too late because it's already all over the place. But yes, no, I do, of course. I mean, I think the cattle class one is the classic one that I do wish, you know, when this BJP-leaning journalist asked me, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? You know, I'd been back a few months. It was an expression I'd heard for 30 years in the West. And I assumed that everybody in India using English would also know that what cattle class meant, that it was, in any case, not derogatory about passenger, but derogatory about airlines for herding us in like cattle. So I replied with my sort of not always effective sense of humor that I will travel cattle class in solidarity with all our holy cows. Well, as you know, I then went off to Liberia, completely out of range, and the proverbial dung hit the fan, with the result that for 2 days, the media, my party, the entire political establishment were denouncing me, calling for my resignation, and I was in Liberia trying to negotiate for the government, blissfully unaware of all of this. It wasn't a happy episode. But having said that, there's some deliberate malice. There were some people who twisted the story, who knew perfectly well or could have looked up what cattle class meant, to reduce it to a caricature, that this is a fellow who thinks ordinary economy class travelers are cattle, was, I think, not particularly pleasantly motivated. And the other aspect of all of this, of course, is that because it was out there in this very narrow medium, it was got the negatives got magnified and got magnified in translation. So when you hear cattle class in Hindi or Malayalam or Gujarati, it becomes a different story.
The idiom changes.
I will still lose votes because of that expression. There are still
you would lose votes.
I'm still losing. There are still people in my constituency who were persuaded at the time by the media that I think that I disdain them all as cattle.
Yeah.
And that therefore, I mean, I've actually had staff members overhearing conversations, people who admire what I've done for the constituency, but say, how can we vote for a guy who thinks we're cattle? So it has caused me damage, and therefore I'll never do it again. I do regret having done it. You know, Shakespeare had that great line, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. So what we have to do on Twitter and any other social media is figure out not what we intend to say when we're saying something, but how it might be heard, including by not particularly well-intentioned people.
definitely speak to the potential of the gaffe online and what kind of ripple effect it can have, and how mindful do American politicians have to be of that, and how you deal with immense negativity. Let's take, for example, Barack Obama's first debate, before, you know, which was panned by everybody, saying, what the hell happened to Obama? Did he just lose his mojo, right? When something like that happens, when you're being panned down line, somebody like you, whose job it is to change the narrative, whether online or offline, what do you do?
Well, I'm not sure if everybody had seen that first debate, but there wasn't much we could have done. You know, I think, you know, I will say that normally in presidential debates in the United States, we have what's called a spin room after, which is where you spin your story when the debate has ended. With the emergence of online media and online communications tools, you can't wait to post-debate spin room to figure out what the storyline is. It's almost immediate as soon as the debate starts. And you know, it wasn't hard to tell that we were losing that debate, but 15 minutes into it, if you watched the Twitter conversation and what was trending, it was very clear that we were going to lose the debate, and there was very little that we could do to change it.